The morning I almost lost everything, I was getting my hair done. That probably sounds like the beginning of a joke. 63 years old, sitting in a salon chair with foil in my hair, and my entire life was about to change. But that's exactly how it happened. Not in a lawyer's office, not at a bank, in a hair salon on the corner of Maple and Ridge Lane, under fluorescent lights with the smell of bleach in the air and an old country station playing low on the radio. I had been coming to that salon for 11 years. My stylist. I'll call her my stylist because that's what she was, but she was also something closer to a witness, had been cutting and colouring my hair since the year my husband passed. She knew things about me that I hadn't told my own children, not because I sat down and confessed them, but because hair appointments are long and silence gets uncomfortable, and eventually you just start talking. She knew I had trouble sleeping. She knew I still kept my husband's reading glasses on the nightstand, even though he'd been gone for 4 years. She knew I was proud of my son, but that we had grown distant in the way that adult children and their parents sometimes do. Not with anger, but with the slow accumulation of missed calls and rescheduled visits. She also knew about the man I had been seeing for the past 7 months. I want to be careful about how I describe him, because for a long time I believed he was a good person. He was 70, retired, said he had sold a landscaping business in Georgia and moved north to be closer to his grandchildren. He was soft-spoken. He brought coffee. He remembered small things, that I preferred decaf, that I didn't like movies with unhappy endings, that the cold bothered my left knee more than my right. I thought that was love. I had been alone long enough that I had forgotten what attention felt like, and I mistook his attention for love. We had met at a grief support group at my church. He had lost his wife 2 years before. He cried the first night quietly, with his hands folded in his lap, and I thought, here is a man who is not afraid of his own sadness. After years of watching people perform strength they didn't feel, that undid me a little. We started talking after the meetings. Then he started driving me home. Then one Thursday evening in November, he asked if I'd like to have dinner somewhere other than the church fellowship hall. I said yes. By February he had met my son. By March he had met my daughter and her husband. My son was cautious in the way that men sometimes are. Polite, measured, asking reasonable questions about where he was from and what he did. My daughter was warmer. Her husband seemed indifferent, which I took as a good sign. Indifference meant no alarm bells. By April, he had started mentioning the house. I own a home in a quiet neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio. My husband and I bought it in 1989 for $112,000. It is worth now considerably more. I have lived in it for 34 years. My children grew up in it. There is a height chart penciled on the inside of the pantry door frame that I have never had the heart to paint over. He didn't suggest I sell it. That would have been too obvious. What he did was more patient than that. He mentioned over dinner one evening that he had a friend, a financial advisor, who had helped him restructure his own assets after his wife died. He said the probate process had been brutal, that so much of what his wife had intended for the grandchildren had been eaten up by taxes and fees. He said he wouldn't wish that on anyone. I said my husband and I had a will. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're pretending to be reassured. He said wills were a start, but that a living trust was really the better vehicle for someone in my situation. He used words like asset protection and stepped-up basis and avoiding the court process. He spoke quietly and without urgency, which is, I now understand, exactly how these things are done. He said his friend could meet with me. No obligation, no fees for the first conversation, just to take a look at my situation and see if there were things I hadn't considered. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I called my son. He said it sounded reasonable, that estate planning was something I probably should have done already, that he'd been meaning to bring it up himself. He said he trusted my judgment. Those 4 words settled something in me that I wish they hadn't. The advisor came to my house on a Tuesday afternoon. He was younger than I expected, early 50s maybe, with a firm handshake and a leather portfolio that looked expensive. He sat at my kitchen table and spread out documents and charts and spoke about things I mostly didn't follow. At one point he drew a diagram on a notepad, arrows and boxes, and said this was essentially what my estate looked like now, and this was what it could look like with the right structure in place. He left a packet of information. He said to take my time. I took 2 weeks. I asked my daughter to look at the materials. She flipped through them at my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon while her husband watched football in the living room. She said it looked legitimate to her, that she'd seen similar things when her co-worker had done their parents' estate planning. She said she trusted me to make the right call. I called the advisor back. He said he'd draw up the paperwork. The appointment was set for a Thursday afternoon, the same day as my standing hair appointment. I had been going every 6 weeks for so long that my stylist kept my slot blocked without me having to ask. I almost cancelled, but I thought I'll get my hair done in the morning, have lunch, sign the papers in the afternoon. A productive day. I drove to the salon. The bell above the door chimed when I walked in. She was finishing up with another client, so I sat in the waiting area and flicked through a magazine without reading it. My mind was somewhere else. I was running through the documents again, the parts I'd read twice and still wasn't sure I fully understood. When she called me back, I sat down in the chair and she draped the cape around my shoulders and asked how I was doing. I said I was fine, a little distracted. She asked about what. I told her not everything but enough, that I had a financial appointment that afternoon, that it had to do with the house, that the man I was seeing had connected me with the advisor. She went quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Her hand slowed on my hair. She asked me to describe the advisor. I did. She asked me his first name. I told her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she set down her comb and said she needed to check something, and she walked to the back of the salon. I thought she was getting more color. She came back maybe 3 minutes later. She sat on her rolling stool in front of me and looked at me in the mirror. She had her phone in her hand. She said, "I need to show you something, and I need you to stay calm." She turned the phone toward me. It was a Facebook post, posted 2 years prior by a woman in Dayton, Ohio. The woman had written about losing her mother, not to death, but to a man who had befriended her mother at a church grief group, introduced her to a financial advisor, and helped that advisor gain power of attorney over her mother's assets. The mother had dementia that had not yet been formally diagnosed. By the time the family understood what had happened, the house had been transferred into a trust that the family couldn't access, and the advisor had withdrawn nearly $60,000 from her mother's accounts under the guise of management fees. The advisor's name in the post was not the same name I had been given, but the description of him, his age, his appearance, his background story, was close enough to make my hands go cold inside my lap. She scrolled down. There were comments. A woman in Cincinnati said something similar had happened to her aunt. A woman in Indianapolis said she recognized the name from a consumer fraud report she'd filed with the state attorney general's office. The thread was long. I stopped reading at some point and just sat there. I said, "The appointment is at 2:00. She said, "I know." I said, "He's been to my house. He's met my children." She didn't say anything. She just reached over and took my hand, still gloved from the color she'd been applying, and held it for a moment. I called my son from the salon parking lot. I was still wearing the cape. I don't remember deciding to walk outside. I just found myself there, standing in the cold with my phone pressed to my ear and foil still in my hair. My son answered on the second ring. I told him what she had shown me. There was a silence on his end that stretched long enough that I thought I had lost the call. Then he said, "Mom, don't go to that appointment." I said, "I know." He said he was calling a friend who worked in the county prosecutor's office. He said I should not contact the advisor or the man I'd been seeing until I had spoken with someone who understood what I was dealing with. He said he would drive up that evening. I went back inside. My stylist finished my hair without either of us saying much. At one point I started to apologize. I'm not sure for what exactly, and she shook her head and said there was nothing to apologize for. She said she had almost not said anything, that she told herself it was none of her business, that she was probably remembering the post wrong, that I was a grown woman who didn't need her opinion. I asked her what made her decide to say something. She thought about it for a moment. She said, "Because you told me you were distracted. You never say that. You're always the one listening to everyone else. And I thought, if she's distracted enough to say so, she's worried. And if she's worried and she goes anyway, I'll never forgive myself." I have thought about that a lot since then, about how the things we almost don't say are sometimes the most important ones. My son arrived that evening with his wife. They sat with me at the kitchen table while I laid out every document the advisor had left. The trust paperwork, the fee agreements, the proposed asset structure. His wife, who had worked in real estate for many years and understood how property transfers were documented, went through each page carefully. She said several things in the paperwork were structured in ways that would have given the advisor control over the distribution of assets from the trust. She said the language around my house was particularly concerning. My son's friend from the prosecutor's office called that night. She asked a number of questions. She said she couldn't comment on an active investigation, but that the description I was providing was consistent with complaints her office had received regarding elder financial exploitation in Central Ohio. She said I should preserve all documents, save any text messages or emails from the man I'd been seeing, and not communicate with either of them until I had spoken with my own attorney. I found out later, through my son, who kept in contact with that office for several months, that the advisor's license had been suspended in Kentucky 2 years prior, following a similar complaint. He was operating in Ohio under a slightly altered name. The man I had been seeing was not his friend, as I had been told. He was what investigators later described as a finder, someone who identified vulnerable targets and made introductions in exchange for a cut of whatever was extracted. He had met me at that grief group deliberately. I think about that more than I probably should. I have tried to understand it, to hold it in my mind without letting it make me smaller. Because that is the thing they are counting on, I think. Not just the money, but the shame. The way a woman my age might look at what happened and decide never to speak of it, because it feels like evidence of stupidity, of loneliness, of being the kind of person who could be fooled. I am not that person, or I have decided not to be. I did eventually speak with an estate attorney, one I found through my own research, with no introductions from anyone. I have a proper will and the beginnings of a legitimate trust structure now. My children are named appropriately. The house, with its pantry door frame and its 34 years of my life, is going where I always intended it to go. I went back to the salon 6 weeks later, as I always do. When I sat down in the chair, my stylist asked how I was feeling. I said, "Better." She nodded and reached for her comb. She didn't make a big thing of it. That was like her. She had given me something enormous, and she was content to let it sit quietly between us, the way the best gifts do. Before I left, I told her that I had written down what she said to me. That line about the things we almost don't say. I told her I had put it on a note card and set it on my husband's nightstand, next to his reading glasses. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Good." That was enough. It was more than enough. I have been asked, since then, whether I am angry. At the man from the grief group, at the advisor, at the systems that apparently allowed this to continue across multiple states for years before anyone put it together formally. Yes, I am angry. But anger, I have found, is most useful when it has somewhere to go. So I have given mine somewhere to go. I have spoken with 2 women from my church who were in situations I recognized, newly widowed, recently befriended, beginning to talk about estate planning with men their children hadn't met. I sat with each of them over coffee and I told them my story plainly, without performing courage I didn't feel. I told them to move slowly, to involve their children, to find their own attorneys through the State Bar Association's referral service, and not through anyone who had been recommended by a new relationship. One of them called me 3 weeks later. She said she had done some checking. She said thank you. That call was worth more to me than I know how to say. There are days when I still catch myself in small moments of grief. Not for the house, which I still have, or the money, which I didn't lose, but for the version of that relationship I had believed in. The coffee, remembered. The decaf. The left knee. I had taken all of that as evidence of a kind of love, and it turned out to be evidence of something else entirely. A careful study. A file being kept. I have made my peace with most of it. I am 63 years old, and I have buried a husband and raised 2 children and kept a house for 34 years, and I am still here. That has to count for something. I have decided that it does. The note card is still on the nightstand. I read it sometimes in the morning before I get up. The things we almost don't say. I am glad she said it. I am glad I was still in the chair, still listening, still the kind of woman who had enough sense to go quiet when someone who knew her looked at her in the mirror and said, "Stay still a moment. I need to show you something." I stayed. That made all the difference. I have thought a lot about what made the difference that morning. Not the Facebook post, not the prosecutor's office, not even my son driving up that same evening with his wife and spreading those documents across my kitchen table. All of that mattered, but none of it would have happened if one person had simply decided it wasn't her place to speak. What she did took something that I think we underestimate in people, a kind of moral courage that doesn't announce itself. It would have been so easy to stay quiet. She had a client in her chair, a schedule to keep, a business to run. The easiest thing in the world would have been to finish my color, make small talk, send me on my way, and never know what happened after. But she had been paying attention to me for 11 years. She noticed when I said I was distracted. She noticed that it wasn't like me. And when she felt that pull, the one that said this might be serious, she didn't talk herself out of it. She followed it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. I think about the man from the grief group. I think about how deliberate it all was. The coffee remembered, the knee, the decaf, how he had studied me the way you study something you intend to take. And I think about how I had read all of that as tenderness. I was not foolish, I was human. Loneliness makes us want to believe that someone is paying close attention because they love us, not because they are taking inventory. The difference between those 2 things can be impossible to see from the inside. That is why what she did, using her own clear eyes when mine were clouded, mattered as much as it did. There is something I have come to believe about how we protect ourselves and each other in this life. It is not always the dramatic intervention. It is not always calling the police or filing the report or confronting someone in a parking lot. Sometimes protection looks like a woman sitting on a rolling stool, turning a phone toward you and saying, "I need you to stay calm." It is small and quiet, and it changes everything. My son's steadiness that evening. The way he didn't panic, didn't say "I told you so," just said "don't go to that appointment," and then started making calls. That was its own kind of strength. Not the loud kind, the kind that shows up and does the next right thing without making you feel smaller for needing it. I am still here. The house is still mine, and I have made it my business since then to be the person who says something. When I sit across from a woman at my church who is newly alone and talking about a man she's just met who seems to know exactly what she needs, I say something, not because I know better than she does, but because I was given a gift that morning in that salon chair, and the only honest thing to do with a gift like that is pass it forward. The note card is still on the nightstand. I read it most mornings before I get up, and every time I do, I think stay present. Use your own eyes. Don't let shame keep you quiet. The things we almost don't say are sometimes the ones that save somebody's life.